A Spanish captain stands on a dry, windswept hillside in 1499, looking out at cactus, thorn scrub, and not a single river in sight. And he makes a decision that will echo for 500 years. He writes this place off as worthless. No gold glinting in the stream beds, because there are no stream beds. No fertile soil for plantations, because the soil barely holds a root. Just heat, wind, and a deep blue harbour that nobody on his ship thinks twice about. He is wrong, though he will never live to find out how wrong. Within a century and a half, this same island becomes one of the busiest slave-trading ports in the entire Western Hemisphere. Its warehouses stacked with human cargo, and its harbour filled with ships flying a flag that isn't Spanish at all. 2 centuries after that, flames roar from refinery towers built to process oil that isn't even found on the island itself, drawing workers from a dozen countries to a rock the Spanish once sailed past without a second glance.
And in the winter of 2026, a goalkeeper born in the Netherlands pulls on a blue jersey and stands between the posts for a nation of roughly 150,000 people, becoming the last line of defence for the smallest country ever to reach the World Cup. While back home, an entire island stops what it's doing to watch. Somewhere in between a Spanish captain's shrug and a goalkeeper's diving save sits one of the strangest, most layered stories in the Caribbean. The story of an island that took 5 centuries to prove everyone wrong about what worthless actually means. To understand how an island earns the nickname useless in the first place, you have to look at what it actually is. Curaçao sits about 65 kilometers off the coast of Venezuela, a low, dry outcrop of limestone and coral just over 400 square kilometers in total, sitting far enough south of the main hurricane belt that storms rarely trouble it directly. Which sounds like good luck, until you realize the same weather pattern that spares it from hurricanes also spares it from the reliable rainfall that built lush, green colonies elsewhere in the Caribbean. Trade winds blow across the island almost constantly, bending the native divi-divi trees into permanent, wind-sculpted leam. And the same winds that dry out the topsoil also keep temperatures from ever climbing to truly unbearable extremes. Where islands like Jamaica or Hispaniola offered Spanish colonizers rainforest, rivers and soil deep enough to grow sugarcane by the ton, Curaçao offered cactus, thornbush, and a landscape so arid that early visitors compared it, not entirely unkindly, to parts of the Sahara. What it did offer, tucked behind a narrow inlet on its southern coast, was a deep, sheltered harbour, the kind that barely existed anywhere else in this stretch of the Caribbean. Wide and calm enough for ocean-going ships to tuck safely inside, regardless of what the weather was doing outside. The Spanish, focused entirely on gold, silver, and farmland, looked at that harbour and saw nothing worth the trouble of defending. Someone else would eventually look at the exact same harbour and see the entire future of Caribbean trade. Long before any European ship approached that harbour, the island already had people living on it. The Caiquetío, an Arawak-speaking people who had settled Curaçao at least several centuries before Columbus's arrival and built a life around fishing, small-scale farming in the island's few fertile pockets, and trade with related communities on the South American mainland just across the water. Inside Hato Cave, a network of limestone caverns carved slowly by dripping water over tens of thousands of years, red ochre rock paintings still mark the walls where Caiquetío hands once pressed pigment into stone. Geometric shapes and figures whose exact meaning has been lost, but whose presence proves something simple and important. People were living full, meaningful lives on this island long before anyone decided to call it useless. When Spanish ships under Alonso de Ojeda arrived in 1499, they found a functioning society, not an empty rock waiting to be discovered. What followed was brutally familiar to anyone who knows the broader story of Spanish contact with the Caribbean's indigenous population.
Within a few decades, most of the Caiquetío were forcibly relocated to Hispaniola to work as labourers. And the island the Spanish had already judged worthless for agriculture became, in their eyes, not even worth the effort of a permanent settlement. For over a century, Curaçao sat largely ignored, a footnote on Spanish maps, its harbour empty except for the occasional passing ship, waiting for someone to look at it differently. That someone arrived in 1634, when a Dutch fleet under Johan van Walbeek seized the island from its small remaining Spanish garrison during the long conflict known as the 80 Years' War. The Dutch West India Company, a private trading company backed by the government of the Netherlands and built specifically to challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance of Atlantic trade, had spent years looking for a base in the Caribbean, somewhere with a defensible harbour close enough to Spanish shipping lanes to disrupt them and close enough to the South American mainland to trade directly with it. Curaçao's harbour, the same one the Spanish had dismissed as not worth defending, turned out to be exactly what the Dutch needed.
Company engineers began fortifying the entrance to what would become known as Sint Annabai, building Fort Amsterdam directly at the harbour mouth. And around it grew a town the Dutch named Willemstad, laid out with the same narrow canal-adjacent streets and stepped gable roof lines you'd find in Amsterdam itself, except reproduced under a punishing tropical sun on a hillside made of coral limestone instead of Dutch clay. Warehouses rose along the waterfront to store goods moving between Europe, Africa and the Americas. Docks extended into the bay to handle ships far larger than the harbour had ever seen. Within a few decades, this island that Spain hadn't wanted enough to garrison properly had become one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate the Dutch Republic controlled anywhere in the world. Not because of what grew on it, but because of where it sat and what ships could do once they reached its harbour.
What those ships increasingly carried, starting in the middle of the 17th century, was people. And this is the part of Curaçao's story that the postcard version tends to move past quickly. The Dutch West India Company designated Curaçao as its primary transshipment hub for the transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean, a role the island held for well over a century. Ships arrived directly from West Africa's slave-trading ports, packed with captives who had already survived a crossing that killed a substantial percentage of everyone forced aboard. And Curaçao's harbour became a holding and distribution point where enslaved Africans were kept, sometimes for weeks, before being resold and shipped onward to plantations across the Spanish Main, other Caribbean islands, and the Dutch colonies of South America.
Historians estimate the total number of enslaved people who passed through the island during this period in the tens of thousands, and the physical infrastructure of that trade, warehouses built specifically to hold human beings until buyers arrived, still stands in parts of Willemstad today, now preserved rather than hidden, most visibly inside the Cura Hollander Museum, where iron shackles, ship manifests and first-hand accounts document a period the island has chosen, in recent decades, to confront directly rather than quietly minimize. Picture a young man the historical record never names, someone we'll call Kwame, arriving in Curaçao's harbour sometime in the 1720s aboard a Dutch slave ship after a crossing that lasted nearly 2 months, weak, disoriented, and marched off the ship into one of the waterfront holding pens to wait, along with several hundred other captives, for buyers from the mainland to arrive and negotiate a price. He would have had no idea, standing in that pen under an unfamiliar sun, that the island beneath his feet was considered a poor place for growing crops, because that fact meant almost nothing to his own situation. Whether Curaçao's soil could support sugarcane was irrelevant to a system that used the island purely as a distribution point, a place to sort and resell human beings before shipping them onward to wherever labour was actually needed. Some captives, like Kwame in this telling, were kept on the island itself, rather than resold immediately, put to work in the small salt pans along the coast, in domestic households in Willemstad, or on the handful of plantations that did manage to scratch out a living growing peanuts, aloe, and small amounts of livestock in the island's few workable pockets of soil.
Life for someone in Kwame's position meant labour without pay, without freedom, and without any legal standing as a person rather than property, under a colonial system that treated the profits of the slave trade as simply another line item in the Dutch West India Company's ledgers. The wealth flowing through Willemstad's warehouses in this period was real. It was also built directly on suffering that the island's modern museums no longer try to soften. That system eventually produced its own resistance, and the most significant uprising in the island's history is remembered today through the name of a single man, Tula. In August of 1795, Tula, an enslaved man working on a plantation on the island's western end, led a rebellion that grew within days to include over 1,000 enslaved people from plantations across the island, a scale of organised revolt that had never occurred on Curaçao before and would never occur again. The uprising drew direct inspiration from the recent Haitian Revolution and from revolutionary ideas circulating out of France, and Tula himself reportedly framed the rebellion not simply as an escape, but as a demand for the same rights of liberty and equality that revolutionary France claimed to champion for all people, a demand the colonial authorities had no intention of honouring for anyone they considered property. The rebellion held out for roughly a month before Dutch colonial forces, reinforced and better armed, suppressed it. Tula was captured, tried and executed, with a brutality specifically intended to terrorise the rest of the island's enslaved population into permanent submission. It worked, in the narrow sense that no uprising of similar scale occurred again before slavery's eventual abolition in the Dutch colonies in 1863, nearly 7 decades later. But Tula's name didn't disappear.
It survived in oral memory among the island's Afro-Curaçaoan community for generations before formal recognition ever caught up. And today, a monument to Tula stands facing the Caribbean Sea, near the site of the rebellion's beginning. A quiet, permanent counterweight to the version of history that once tried to erase him entirely. The decades following Emancipation in 1863 were, if anything, economically harder for much of the island's population than the period before it. Formerly enslaved people gained legal freedom, but little else. No land, no capital, and few opportunities beyond continuing to work for the same plantation owners and merchant families who had profited from their labour while enslaved, now for minimal wages instead of none at all. The island's agricultural base, thin to begin with, offered nowhere near enough work to absorb a newly free population, and emigration became a common survival strategy, with Curaçaoans leaving for other Caribbean islands, Venezuela, and eventually the Netherlands itself, in search of paid work that simply didn't exist at home. For nearly 60 years after abolition, Curaçao drifted along as a modest, struggling colonial outpost, its slave-trading glory days long over, and nothing yet arrived to replace them. The harbour that had once made the island indispensable to the Dutch West India Company sat comparatively quiet, handling local trade and the occasional passing ship, waiting, much as it had waited before 1634, for someone to find a new reason the island mattered. That reason arrived from an unexpected direction in the early 20th century, not from anything found on Curaçao itself, but from something found across the water in Venezuela: oil. When major petroleum reserves were discovered around Lake Maracaibo in the 1910s, Royal Dutch Shell needed somewhere nearby to refine the crude before shipping it onward to markets in Europe and the Americas. And Venezuela's own political instability made building major industrial infrastructure directly on Venezuelan soil a genuine risk. Curaçao, stable, Dutch-administered, and equipped with that same deep harbour the Spanish had once ignored,
offered exactly what Shell needed: a secure, well-governed location close enough to the oil fields to make short-haul tanker shipments practical. Construction on the Isla refinery began in 1915, and within a decade it had grown into one of the largest oil refining operations anywhere in the world, transforming Curaçao's economy overnight in a way nothing had since the peak of the slave trade 2 centuries earlier. Picture a man we'll call Domingo, arriving in Willemstad in 1928 from a small village in the Dominican Republic, drawn by word that Shell was hiring workers from across the Caribbean and Latin America faster than local labour could fill the positions. He wasn't alone. Workers arrived from Venezuela, Suriname, the Dutch and British Caribbean islands, and further afield still, forming entirely new immigrant communities almost overnight, in a place that had, until that point, been demographically shaped almost exclusively by its Dutch colonial administration and its Afro-Curaçaoan majority, descended from the slave trade era. Domingo found work as a labourer at the refinery, 12-hour shifts in brutal heat, radiating off the processing towers, earning wages that were modest by international standards, but represented far more money than most Caribbean labourers could earn anywhere else in the region during those years. He sent part of his pay home to family in the Dominican Republic, learned enough Dutch to follow instructions on the refinery floor, and enough Papiamentu to get by in the market, and eventually married a Curaçaoan woman he met at a dance hall in Otrobanda, raising children who grew up speaking 3 languages fluently before they ever set foot in a classroom. Men like Domingo didn't just work the refinery, they rebuilt the island's population and its cultural mixture almost from scratch, layering new immigrant communities directly on top of a society already shaped by centuries of Dutch, African, and indigenous influence.
That layering of languages and cultures had actually begun centuries earlier, and it produced something unique to the island long before Shell ever arrived: Papiamentu, a Creole language that developed among enslaved and free Afro-Curaçaoans, starting sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century. Built primarily from Portuguese and Spanish vocabulary, heavily layered with Dutch, West African linguistic structures, and even fragments borrowed from the island's original Caiquetío language, blending into something that belongs entirely to Curaçao and nowhere else. For most of its history, Papiamentu was treated by the island's Dutch colonial administration as a lesser dialect, unsuitable for government business, formal education, or serious literature. Something spoken at home and in the market, but not written down in any official capacity. That began to change dramatically after 1969, when a wave of labor unrest and social protest on the island, driven partly by economic frustration and partly by a broader push for cultural recognition, forced a reckoning with which parts of Curaçaoan identity actually deserved respect. Papiamentu, the language most islanders had grown up speaking at home their entire lives, became a central symbol of that reckoning, gradually gaining recognition in schools, media, and eventually government administration over the following decades. Today, Papiamentu, Dutch, English, and Spanish are all spoken across the island, more or less interchangeably, depending on who's talking to whom. And it's entirely normal for a single conversation in a Willemstad market to shift between all 4 within a few sentences. The island's political relationship with the Netherlands went through its own significant transformation across the 20th century.
Curaçao existed for most of that period as part of the Netherlands Antilles, a federation of Dutch Caribbean territories governed collectively under the Dutch crown, a status formalised in 1954 that granted the islands significant internal self-governance while keeping foreign policy and defence under Dutch control. That federal arrangement lasted more than half a century before its own internal tensions, differing priorities between islands as geographically and culturally distinct as Curaçao, Aruba and Sint Maarten, eventually made it unworkable.
The Netherlands Antilles formally dissolved in October of 2010, and Curaçao emerged from that dissolution as a constituent country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, a status roughly comparable to the relationship the Netherlands itself has with the broader European framework it sits inside. Fully self-governing on internal matters, holding Dutch citizenship and passports, but distinct enough to run its own government, courts, and economic policy, rather than functioning as a simple overseas territory. That constitutional relationship shapes daily life on the island in ways both practical and symbolic. Visible most clearly in Willemstad itself, a city split cleanly in two by the entrance to Sint Annabai, the narrow channel connecting the harbour to open sea. On the eastern side sits Punda, the old colonial quarter, its narrow street fronts painted in the pastel yellows, mints and corals that have made it one of the most photographed streetscapes in the Caribbean. A look so distinctly Dutch that visitors regularly describe it as a corner of Amsterdam that somehow drifted into the tropics and decided to stay. On the western side sits Otrobanda, historically the quarter where Afro-Curaçaoan and working-class residents lived, and where street art now covers old colonial-era walls in murals that turn entire blocks into open-air galleries. Connecting the two sides is the Queen Emma Bridge, a pontoon bridge that floats directly on the water and swings entirely open whenever a large ship needs to pass through the channel. A routine interruption that residents have folded so completely into daily rhythm that nobody seems bothered by it. Pedestrians simply stop, watch the ship glide past at close range, and continue across once the two halves reconnect, treated less like an inconvenience and more like a small, recurring piece of civic theatre everyone's seen 100 times before. Daily life beyond the bridge tends to spill outward rather than staying contained behind walls, and that habit shows up architecturally as much as socially. Many homes across the island are built with wide front porches, oversized doors, and yards that open almost directly onto the street, blurring the line between private home and public neighborhood life in a way that would feel unusual in most places built around individual privacy. In the late afternoon, when the day's heat finally starts to break, residents sit on those porches and call conversations across low fences to neighbors doing the same thing. An entire block essentially functioning as one shared living room for an hour or two before dinner. On higher ground outside the city, older Landhausen, grand plantation-era manor houses with arched roofs and wide covered corridors, still stand overlooking the dry valleys where enslaved and later free labourers once worked, whatever thin soil the island offered. A stark physical reminder that the same landscape held both comfort and hardship, depending entirely on which side of it you were born into. That habit of open, porch-facing living has carried forward even as housing has modernised, and it connects to one of the island's most enduring greetings, dushi, a Papiamentu word that functions as hello, thank you sweetheart, and general warm acknowledgement all at once, deployed constantly enough that visitors usually pick it up within their first day on the island, whether they mean to or not. Picture a woman we'll call Marisol, running her family's stall at the floating market for going on 30 years now, learning the trade as a girl from her mother, who learned it from her own mother before her, back when the boats still arrived under sail instead of outboard motor. Marisol grew up speaking Papiamentu at home and Spanish with the Venezuelan traders who bring the produce across each morning, switching between the two so fluidly that she sometimes doesn't notice she's done it until a customer looks confused, at which point she simply switches to Dutch or English instead, whichever gets the sale. She remembers her mother telling her that the market used to feel fragile, dependent entirely on a relationship with Venezuela that could sour overnight, depending on politics neither of them had any control over. And in recent years, that fragility has become harder to ignore, as instability across the water has made some traders reluctant to make the crossing at all. Still, most mornings the boats keep coming, mangoes and avocados stacked in wooden crates the same way they've always been stacked.
And Marisol keeps opening her stall before sunrise, because the alternative, watching one of the island's oldest continuous traditions quietly disappear, isn't something she's willing to accept without a fight. Much of that daily rhythm still runs, quite literally, on the sea. Before dawn, wooden boats from the Venezuelan coast arrive at the floating market in Willemstad, loaded with bananas, mangoes, avocados and coconuts, harvested just hours earlier across the water. And within a few hours, the produce is arranged on stools along the harbour edge, vendors speaking Spanish and customers answering in Papiamentu against a backdrop of pastel Dutch gables glowing under the morning sun. Fishing boats leave from separate docks, chasing tuna, red snapper and Caribbean lobster, most of the catch reaching local markets and restaurant kitchens by midday. Further along the waterfront, the actual port of Willemstad keeps a steadier, larger-scale rhythm going. Container ships and cargo vessels arriving and departing constantly. A modern echo of the exact same strategic advantage, a deep, sheltered harbour along a major shipping corridor that first drew the Dutch here in 1634, and that the Spanish had dismissed as not worth the effort a century earlier. What began as a slave-trading transshipment point and later became an oil refining hub is today, at its core, still a shipping economy, just repackaged for a modern global supply chain. Tourism has grown into the island's largest single source of income over the past few decades, drawing visitors to turquoise water, coral reefs, and the coastline that changes character dramatically depending on which side of the island you're standing on.
In the northwest, Cristóbal National Park protects the most untouched stretch of Curaçao's dry interior. And from the summit of Sint Christoffelberg, the island's highest point at just over 370 meters, the whole landscape splits visibly into two shades of blue. Arid scrubland stretching one direction and open Caribbean Sea stretching the other. Along the northern coast, at Sete Boca National Park, the calm turquoise water most tourists picture disappears entirely, replaced by Atlantic swells that crash violently into limestone sea caves, sending columns of spray high into the air at formations locals call Boca Tabla and Boca Pistol, a reminder that the same geology, gentle enough to shelter a harbour on one side of the island, can turn genuinely dangerous on the other. Just offshore, the seafloor drops abruptly from a few dozen meters to well over 1,000, a formation divers call the Blue Edge. And inside underwater caverns along the coast, sunlight filtering through submerged openings creates a glowing blue light that makes the whole chamber look lit from somewhere deep inside the ocean itself. One of the more striking examples of an island that looks dry and unremarkable from above, while hiding something genuinely extraordinary just beneath the surface. Divers who've spent time in both places sometimes describe the sensation as almost disorienting, leaving a landscape that looks like it belongs in a spaghetti western and dropping straight into water so clear and so densely packed with coral, sponge and reef fish that it feels like an entirely different country stitched onto the bottom of the same island. That contrast between surface and substance extends into the island's most famous export, a bright blue liqueur that carries Curaçao's own name around the world. Blue Curaçao is flavoured using the dried peel of the Laraja, a bitter orange variety that arrived with early Spanish settlers, thrived unexpectedly in the island's dry climate, even after the fruit itself turned out to be too bitter to eat, and sat largely ignored for generations, until distillers discovered that its peel, dried under the same relentless sun that made the fruit inedible, produced an intensely aromatic oil, perfect for flavouring liqueur. A fruit the island's own agricultural history had essentially written off as useless, became, like the harbour before it and the island itself before that, the exact ingredient that made Curaçao internationally recognisable.
its name now appearing on liquor store shelves and cocktail menus in countries where almost nobody could otherwise place the island on a map.
Even the island's marine conservation efforts have taken on that same reflexive resourcefulness. Lionfish, an invasive species with no natural predators in Caribbean waters, have spread aggressively across the island's reefs in recent years, and rather than treating the problem purely as an ecological crisis, local divers have turned lionfish hunting into both a conservation tool and a culinary trend, spearing the fish themselves and delivering them directly to restaurant kitchens, where they show up on dinner plates the same evening. Whatever the island happens to have too much of, however unwanted it initially seems, someone here has usually figured out how to turn it into something worth having. It's worth pausing here on a connection to another island story this channel has already told, because the parallel runs deeper than simple coincidence. Bermuda, a small, isolated rock in the North Atlantic that colonial explorers once dismissed as having nothing worth settling for. No farmland, no fresh water source anywhere on its surface, eventually turned that apparent uselessness into genuine advantage. First through shipbuilding and maritime trade, and centuries later through a reinsurance industry that now manages a meaningful share of the entire world's catastrophe risk from a handful of low-rise office buildings. Curaçao's story follows an almost identical emotional arc on a different stage. Dismissed early as worthless by the same broad wave of Spanish exploration that first charted the Caribbean, valued later purely for its harbour rather than anything it could grow, and repeatedly forced to build value out of whatever it happened to have on hand: a strategic location, an inedible fruit, an invasive fish, a language nobody outside the island speaks.
Both places proved the same stubborn point from opposite corners of the Atlantic. A landscape judged worthless by one set of eyes only stays worthless until someone looks at it differently. And history keeps handing that second look to the people patient enough to wait for it. Which brings the story back, finally, to a soccer pitch and a goalkeeper. Curaçao's national football program had spent decades as a modest regional presence, occasionally competitive within the Caribbean, but never seriously threatening to reach a World Cup against nations with populations, budgets, and youth academies dozens of times its size. Eloy Room, born in the Netherlands to a Curaçaoan father, had come up through Dutch youth national teams before choosing, in 2015, to represent Curaçao instead, a decision that quietly reflected the same layered identity, Dutch citizenship, Caribbean heart, that defines so much of the island itself.
Over the following decade, a golden generation of Curaçaoan and Curaçaoan Dutch players slowly built a program capable of competing on a genuinely international level, and in 2026, against odds that most analysts considered close to impossible, Curaçao qualified for the World Cup, becoming the smallest nation by population ever to reach the tournament. Their opening match against Germany ended in a lopsided 7-1 defeat, the kind of scoreline that could have defined the entire tournament as a footnote, except Curaçao scored in that match too, their first ever World Cup goal, met with celebrations back home loud enough that residents later described hearing entire neighbourhoods erupt simultaneously.
Their second match against Ecuador produced something even more remarkable, a scoreless draw, anchored by Eloy Room making save after save under sustained pressure for the full 90 minutes, earning the tiny nation its first ever World Cup point and turning its goalkeeper into a permanent island hero. Somewhere in the stands and in living rooms back on the island, people who had grown up hearing that Curaçao was too small, too dry, too poor in natural resources to ever matter on a global stage, watched their flag appear on the same broadcast as Germany's and Ecuador's, and understood exactly what that moment meant without anyone needing to explain it. American volunteers working the tournament's fan events later described entire crowds of Curaçaoan supporters showing up hours early just to stand in line together, cheerful and patient under the sun, treating a football tournament on the other side of the world like a natural extension of the same porch and neighbour culture they'd grown up with back home, just scaled up to fit a stadium instead of a street corner. None of this erases the harder chapters. The wealth that first built Willemstad's warehouses came from human trafficking on a scale that still shapes the island's demographics and its collective memory centuries later. The oil boom that rescued the economy after Emancipation brought real opportunity alongside real exploitation. Refinery labour that paid better than most regional alternatives while still extracting maximum value from workers who had few other options.
Even today, rising fuel costs and shipping delays remind the island constantly how dependent it remains on the outside world for nearly everything beyond fish and produce. And plenty of young Curaçaoans holding Dutch passports that offer a direct path to opportunities more than 8,000 kilometers away in Europe quietly weigh whether staying on an island this small and this exposed to global economic shocks is worth it compared to leaving for good. Curaçao's history was never a clean, uncomplicated success story, and it would be dishonest to tell it as one now. But history rarely offers anyone a clean story, uncomplicated or otherwise, and Curaçao's version keeps circling back to the same essential shape, no matter which century you're looking at. Something dismissed, overlooked, or actively exploited eventually gets re-examined and turned into a source of real value by people with nowhere else to go and no reason to give up. A dry rock became a harbour empire. A holding pen for human trafficking became a museum that refuses to look away from its own past. A bitter, inedible orange became a liqueur famous on every continent. A goalkeeper's father's homeland became the smallest nation ever to share a World Cup pitch with Germany. None of it happened because the island was lucky. It happened because 5 centuries after one Spanish captain decided this place wasn't worth the trouble, the people who actually lived here kept proving, one reinvention at a time, that he'd never really understood what he was looking at.